Kenya to Colombia, from Iraq to Korea, in slums, in schools, in prisons, and in theaters. Every day, people gather at TEDx events around the world to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. Today, you are part of a global conversation about our shared future. So what is this TEDx? TEDx is an initiative of the TED Conference, a nonprofit devoted to ideas worth spreading. We grant free licenses to allow TED-like events to spread globally. This event today is based on the TED Conference format and ideals, but is independently organized by your local community. So please make sure to thank the team of volunteers who worked so hard on today's event. It's their ideas, dedication, and time that made it all possible. It's they who booked all the speakers, and the views you'll hear today are, of course, those of those speakers, not necessarily of TEDs. But we hope their talks spark an exciting conversation among you. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for openness and for critical thinking, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you'll take out. And now, on with the show.
Hello. My name is Crystal Clark, and I am so excited to welcome you all to TEDx Vanderbilt University. I serve as the Director of Employee Learning and Engagement over in Vanderbilt Human Resources, and I have the privilege of serving as your host and navigator through all of our ideas we're spreading today. Now, our speakers have been preparing for this moment for months, and we are so proud of the time and the effort that they have put into their talks that they will present to you right here from this red circle. We know and truly believe that today's talks will move you to think, feel, and act long after you leave this space. And our hope is that in some way you will leave here changed because of what you've heard, not only from the people in this circle, but also what you will hear from each other, and also, if you follow along with social media, the conversations that you will have virtually. Now, you all play a huge role in this show, and so before we get started, we want to set a few ground rules for you all. For this event to be a success, we need you to help us out with a few things. Now, when our speakers are on stage in this circle, we ask that you work really hard to not create any extraneous noise. Be still. Maybe don't sneeze or cough so much. Maybe don't unwrap loud things. These talks are being recorded by the cameras that you see around you, and we want to make sure that we have a really great product so that we can upload those onto the TEDx platform where these talks will live forever. Forever, right? We want to make them as crisp and clear as possible. So if you need to leave, please wait in between speakers to do so. Take all the notes that you want. Let one of the volunteers know. We have volunteers outside that can give you pen and paper if you need to. Most of you have a notes app on your phone, and we encourage you to jot down your ideas and your thoughts as your questions as we go throughout today. We don't have any food this year for a variety of reasons, but there are vending machines outside. So if your tummy starts grumbling, remember we want to control for extraneous noise. We have great vending machines outside. You can go to those during intermission or during a break for yourself so that you can take care of yourself today. We'll have an intermission after the first 4 talks, a 15-minute intermission, so be aware of that. Speaking of phones, during the talks, it would be great if you could dim the brightness on your phone. And please make sure they are on silent mode. If you haven't done that already, please do that right now while I'm looking at you, judging you, and holding you accountable. We are not against phones, and we strongly encourage you to use them to engage with the event. If you're someone who's on Twitter, you can visit @TEDxVandy or use the hashtag @TEDxVandy to share your thoughts. We want to hear your aha moments. Some of these people are going to pose some really important questions to you, and you can answer them. You can also take photos with your phone, no flash photography, and you can also take videos on your phone if you would like to do so. As a bonus to get you on social media, we have 3 giveaways today. And how are we going to pick our winners? Through Twitter. So if you share a thought, an idea, a question, I may call out your name in a little bit, and we have a lovely gift bag for you in the back. Who doesn't want to win things, right? I do, but they told me I can't win. TEDx does not include a Q&A. Any questions, thoughts, anything you want to say to our speakers, they will be available to you during intermission and after the show. They would love to meet you, talk to you, sign autographs, take selfies, whatever you need from them, but we do not have a Q&A during the show. And we do expect you to stay for the entire time throughout today's event. We have a roster of 7 speakers that I know you're going to want to be here for. We all have a very long to-do list, but I super promise you that you will not regret the time that you spent today immersed in these ideas. So can you give me a strong head nod or a thumbs up to say that you agree with all that I put forth today? Y'all are a lovely crowd, just so into it. So I think we're good. So are you ready for some talks? Give me some energy. Awesome. Natalie Serrett is a first-year Master of Theological Studies student at Vanderbilt Divinity School and has lived in Nashville for 3 years working in the nonprofit space as a writer and editor. Born and raised overseas in the Middle East and Central Asia, Natalie developed a love for the written and spoken word and its ability to transcend cultural and personal differences through the power of storytelling. She hopes to continue working on behalf of marginalized communities all over the world to ensure equal rights and the guarantee of dignity for all. With her talk, Bad Theology is a Serial Killer, Natalie invites us to learn the consequences of being in proximity to communities that hold space for poor theologies. So let's give a warm welcome to our first speaker of the day, Natalie Serrett.
What would you say if I told you that we know who and what the biggest serial killer of queer youth in the United States is? That we know not only that, but also why they are the leading cause of death to LGBTQIA children in the United States, and we are doing next to nothing about it. I want you to keep that question in mind while I tell you a story. In 2016, I was a junior at a severely fundamentalist evangelical in the mountains of Virginia. And every day for 9 months that year, I stood in front of my dorm sink mirror and I stared at myself. I examined the contours of my face and I looked into my own eyes, frantically searching for a single reason to stay alive. Any reason. And every day for 9 months that year, I told myself that unless I found justification enough to quell the chaos in my head and heart, I would end my life. Now, doing this every day for nearly a year is not exactly your therapist's daily recommended affirmations, right? But I did it because I was a queer teenager attending America's largest evangelical university. And it was at this university that we had required convocations 3 times a week, at which famous Christian pastors, authors, motivational speakers would come and talk to us about a variety of topics, but one of the main ones of which was human sexuality. So for the better part of 3 years at that point, I had sat in an auditorium of 10,000 people and watched as standing ovations were given to famous Christian men and women for teaching us about the dangers of lesbianism, the waywardness of the gay lifestyle, and essentially how sad I was making God with my sexuality. Now, I venture to say that any person who identifies as queer would also find it difficult after that long to not also wind up contemplating taking their own life. Personally speaking for myself, I consider it no less an act of God than a miracle that, number one, I'm standing before you today alive, and number two, that I am still an active and engaged member of Christian community. And herein lies the problem. Pastors across the Bible Belt into the Midwest and even the Pacific Northwest have platforms that allow them to reach hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people every week. And some of them are choosing to preach death. They are giving enthusiastic eulogies to the queer youth of America, and we are letting them. Now, even if you're not directly involved in crimes against queer children, as most of us are not, obviously, if we do decide to remain silent in the face of the denigration and the vilification of LGBTQIA children, we are by default made complicit. And when this happens over and over again, as it does in the church, it becomes serial. When pastors fail to denounce acts of violence against the queer community, when they fail to do the research before preaching condemnation over their closeted queer congregants, when they allow codified hate speech to be preached from their podiums, they are inciting violence, and in many tragic cases, death. And when we see these spiritual leaders take to popular social media platforms, we maybe comment on a post, maybe block them, maybe warn our friends to no longer adhere to their teachings. And yet the fact still remains that LGBTQIA children are 4 times as likely as our peers to attempt suicide. It is the second leading cause of death among our youth. 70% of us have reported public harassment, and queer children are twice as likely to experience violent physical assault. Now, these numbers are already mind-boggling, but they skyrocket when queer kids are in religious spaces. Even though Christian communities' main claim is to love our neighbors, recent studies have actually shown that if a queer child is being raised in a religiously or spiritually affiliated household, their chances of attempting suicide double. They double. The empirical evidence is in. We know who and what the biggest serial killer of queer youth in America is, and it is bad theology. Bad theology is quite literally killing us. Bad theology is causing the very real deaths of human beings who, if you do adhere to a Christian worldview, are made in the image of God. Now, if our elected political leaders, if the senators, the presidents, the board chairs of our world consistently maintained rhetoric that contributed to their own constituents dying at twice the rate of their opponents, they would hear about that in their next poll, in their next focus group, in their next town hall. If they consistently adhered to language that was causing harm to their voters at double the rate of others, there would be consequences, whether monetarily, politically, socially, morally. The fact is, there would be repercussions for this fact becoming public knowledge. So where is that accountability for our elected spiritual leaders? For the deacons, the bishops, the youth ministers, the pastors of America? We will demand that political leaders speak to the issues of the day or that local leaders comment on current events, but the people who we allow to instruct our children about their body image, about their self-knowledge, about their entire relationship to and perception of the divine, those people are often acquitted without thought, though we allow them to inform our children about their very hearts that will inform them for the rest of their lives. But it doesn't have to be this way. We have checks and balances in government systems that ensure that public defamation does not go unchecked. And if nothing else, the media does hold those who are spewing this kind of rhetoric accountable. So where is that in our places of worship? Even if it is a simple lunch with your pastor or a sit down after work with your deacon, it is worth it to create the slightest bit of hesitancy the next time that they sit down to write Sunday school curriculum or a Sunday service sermon. It is worth it because we've become desensitized to death over the last few decades of school and nightclub shootings, COVID death tolls, suicide rates. But the sad reality is each statistic we hear about holds real human beings with loved ones. Perhaps aspirations to be a sous chef, a single mom to twin boys who will turn out to be much more trouble than she'd planned, a musician who busks on the street for free simply because it brings her joy, an accountant who can find rhythm and stability in rows of numbers. Regardless, we should not have to provide justification of a human life because of sexual orientation. And even more than that, there should not be spiritual leaders in places of power who demand further justification of a human life because of sexual preferences. This is not a matter of political ideology. This is not Catholic versus Protestant, liberal versus conservative. This is about ensuring that our kids are not taught to make value judgments about themselves and others based off of something as unmalleable as the color of their hair or eyes. Regardless of where you stand on gay rights or side A versus side B Christianity, we have a moral obligation as human beings, and if you are one, as people of faith, to ensure that our holy books are not being weaponized and our sacred spaces are not being usurped and used to harm our fellow human beings. I don't want there to be another me, standing in a white concrete dorm room, wondering what method of suicide would cause their friends and family the least amount of trauma. We cannot stand by with the masses of the Bible Belt and continue to watch as our youth take their own lives, firmly believing that the only way they will ever see heaven is if they die before they find love on earth. I cannot withstand the weight of being counted a doctrinal serial killer. I demand more of my spiritual leaders. You can demand more of your spiritual leaders. And I pray to God we do. Thank you.
Let's give Natalie another round of applause, please. Woo. What a beautiful and strong start to the day. We have heard these talks probably 45 times, and I'm still like crying, so excuse me. But thank you so much, Natalie, for sharing with us today. Now remember, we want you to engage with social media during and after the talks. This would be a great time to post a quote, something that Natalie made you think about, any LinkedIn questions that you have about the topic. Remember at TEDxVandy on Twitter or hashtag TEDxVandy, and we look forward to reading your thoughts and reactions. Our next speaker is Sarah Beth Huntley. Sarah Beth is a, yeah, go ahead and cheer. I love it. Sarah Beth is a sophomore, double majoring in cinema and media arts and English on the creative writing track. While passionate in film, she also harbors many passions surrounding making positive change, a topic around which her talk centers. Sarah Beth dreams of becoming a professional filmmaker and an activist for change within the film industry, surrounding diversity behind and in front of the camera, as we will hear in her talk today. So join me in welcoming Sarah Beth.
Favorite show, and when you do, raise your hand. Now, put your hand down if none of the characters in your show are black. If your hand is still up, put your hand down if the main character is not black. Now take a look around. I think by doing this exercise, we can all see that Hollywood has a diversity issue that needs to be addressed. Just think about the differences in your answers if I asked about Asian characters or Latino characters or any other person of color. Would your answers be different? Statistically speaking, they would not. Growing up, I dreamed of being a Disney princess. I would spend hours watching the movies and singing the songs, dressed up in the various shoes, gowns, and crowns. However, as I got older, I slowly began to realize that none of these princesses looked like me. In fact, until age 7, when Disney released The Princess and the Frog, I used to tell my mother that Jasmine was my favorite Disney princess because she was as close as I could get to a princess that looked like me. I tell you all this to say, the media we absorb affects how kids of color view themselves, mostly in negative ways. However, it also impacts how majority groups view minority groups, as children are especially susceptible to the influence of media. When children absorb media that either lacks people of color or presents them in a negative light, they interpret these ideas as being how society is, leading to the acceptance of stereotypes and the inheritance of biases. As a Black woman with dreams of becoming a film writer and director, I personally feel the urge to address this issue as I see myself facing a similar uphill battle behind the scenes as well. Today, I'm going to reflect on society's as well as my own experience with the Black best friend stereotype, how this and other tropes impacts how society views people of color, and what we all can do to combat the issue of a lack of positive representation in the media. Now, I have to admit, in the past decade in terms of representation, we have seen strides. From the success of Black Panther and Girls Trip to the race-blind casting of Halle Bailey as Ariel in the upcoming Little Mermaid remake, steps have been taken to increase Black storytelling. However, many shows and films now view having Black characters as positive representation. This has led to the popularity of the Black best friend stereotype. This trope happens when a Black character is cast as the main character's best friend, but not provided their own storyline or character arc. Instead, they serve as foils and providers of advice to the often white main character, and often hold harmful stereotypes of Black people, presenting as unintelligent, aggressive, loud, and sassy. There are plenty of examples across film and television. Dion from the movie Clueless, Angela from the show Boy Meets World, Chastity from the movie 10 Things I Hate About You, and as for male characters, Sam and Rhodey from the Marvel movies, Frozone from The Incredibles, Chad from the High School Musical movies. I could literally go on. Now, this may seem like it's not a big deal, but there are several reasons why it is. First, the history. Many core Black stereotypes were born out of the era of minstrel shows, in which white actors donned blackface on stage. Blackface then first became a facet of cinema in D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which is said by many to be the birthplace of Black stereotypes in film. This later led to blackface characters being portrayed by many famous white actors, from Judy Garland to Mickey Mouse. Now, these blackface characters eventually evolved into several stereotypes of Black people that work to dehumanize them, with two of the most common being the Mammy and Uncle Tom. The Mammy and Uncle Tom tended to be larger Black people with dark skin who were unintelligent, lazy, slow, subservient to white characters, and known for caring for these white characters and their families more than their own. The Black best friend is a direct descendant of the Mammy and Uncle Tom, with their two most notable characteristics being their tendency to provide comic relief and their use as a servant to the white main character through providing advice or help through various obstacles. The tropes are so similar, in fact, it could be argued that Gone with the Wind's Mammy, portrayed by Hattie McDaniel, served as one of the first Black best friends through her love and service provided to Scarlett. Going back to how this affects children, children absorbing media with Black best friends can take in this trope, and this can create biases within them that lead them to view Black people as inferior, less intelligent, and subservient. Marie Castaneda, a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, backed this up with research, stating in a 2018 paper that children become adults whose values are in part shaped by a media system that in the US is based on a capitalist, racist, and sexist framework in its content and regulatory processes. This is why I'm specifically advocating for positive representation, as this trope can seem harmless, but can lead to more biases than a complete lack of representation of Black characters. And this doesn't just affect non-Black children either. Sociologist and author Nancy Yuen wrote an article for Forbes in which she stated that researchers have found that prolonged television exposure predicts a decrease in self-esteem for all girls and Black boys, but an increase in self-esteem for white boys. These practices correlate with the racial and gender practices in Hollywood, which predominantly cast white men as heroes while erasing or subordinating other groups as villains, sidekicks, and sexual objects. I hope by now it is clear to you all that Hollywood has some serious reforming to do. The question is how? I believe that true representation in front of the camera cannot happen until there's true representation behind the camera. This correlation between a lack of representation on and off screen is clear when looking at the fact that Black talent last year made up 15.1% of directors and 13.5% of writers, according to the UCLA Hollywood Diversity Report. When looking at other groups, such as Asian, Hispanic, and Indigenous writers and directors, these numbers are even more marginal. And this is nothing in comparison to the about 3/4 share that white writers and directors maintain. The lack of representation is obvious even when looking at past Oscar winners, with no Black person ever winning Best Film Editing, Best Cinematography, or Best Director. Focusing on finding new Black talent among producers, writers, and directors can lead to more representation that avoids negative stereotypes and presents Black people in a positive, normal way. I believe we can achieve this change through the 4 R's: reflect, reteach, reach out, and rebuild. First, reflect. We must reflect on ourselves. We can't get rid of the media that already exists, so instead we must view it through a new lens of appreciation for the things we enjoy, with the recognition of the harmful stereotypes being presented in various characters. For example, I can love the movie Clueless, while also recognizing and not taking to heart the representation of Dion's character. Second, reteach. We must make sure children especially are exposed to positive representations of diversity and reteach them how to view children who are different from them. There are so many shows now that actively depict children from various backgrounds collaborating together. And as someone with a 7-year-old brother, I am always helping my parents stay on the lookout for media for him, with lots of representation of not just Black kids, but kids from many different identities. Third, reach out. We must address the diversity issue at the root and reach out to kids of color. Many aspects of breaking into the film industry surround connections, meaning it takes some level of privilege to make it. Part of the issue of a lack of diversity is due to the apparent disinterest in fostering the passions of young kids of color who don't have the materials or social capital necessary to make it. I have already taken steps to do this by helping come up with a mentorship program for kids interested in filmmaking during my summer internship at Connect the Writers. Finally, we must rebuild Hollywood and call executives to action. This has already been underway for the past couple years, and the diversity in Hollywood is only going to continue to grow, but we must continue to hold executives accountable for the lack of color behind the scenes. I personally feel the urge to see these issues fixed as I see myself going into a field that doesn't privilege my lived experience or creative point of view. I refuse to be the Black best friend in life and in society, and like my fellow Black creators, will do my best to be heard and seen. What will you do? Thank you.
Let's hear it again for Sarah Beth. I would love to know what all of your favorite TV shows are, so we can talk about that at intermission. But you could also go ahead and tweet it right now. And speaking of Twitter, we have our first giveaway. Are you ready? Are you excited? Now this handle makes me curious, so maybe this person should do a TED Talk next year. But the handle is if_you_new, spelled KNU, if you knew. If I knew what? If you knew, you are our first giveaway winner. Are you in the room? Come on up, friend. We can also talk about what you'd like me to know.
I had my Twitter on private for a while, but I didn't like how new was spelled like KNEW, so I was like, I'll be cute and quirky and do it with a U.
Well, it worked out for you. Now you're a winner. Thank you so much for being here today. Let's give her a round of applause. So the prizes are real, people. Things exist backstage just for you. So keep tweeting. 2 more to go. Feel lucky. Now on to our next speaker of the day. Okay, can I hear that again, please? I love it. I love this solo yay. That's awesome. She did hear you back there. Dr. Mallow is Burry Chair in Cognitive Childhood Development, Professor of Neurology and Pediatrics, and Director of the Sleep Division at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She has a very light load. Dr. Mallow's clinical and research interests focus on improving health and quality of life for individuals with developmental disabilities across the lifespan. She serves as the core director for clinical translation research at Vanderbilt's Kennedy Center. Beth is going to share with us a transformational idea on how we can become more effective communicators of science to better serve our communities. Please put your hand together for Dr. Beth Mallow.
Have you ever gotten a text from a friend which challenged you to respond in a new way? Well, that's what happened to me a few months ago. My friend texted me to ask, should I get the COVID vaccine? Now, I'm a professor of neurology and pediatrics and a health researcher at Vanderbilt Medical Center. And as a doctor, while my first instinct was to launch into why we all needed to get the vaccine to protect ourselves and our communities, I struggled with whether that well-rehearsed pitch was the right one to help my friend make this important personal decision. As someone deeply committed to communicating science to the public, which includes talking to our friends, I decided to try something different, to approach my friend in a new way. I gave her a call. I said, hey, I'm curious. What are your worries about the vaccine? I expected her to talk to me about her fears of a reaction to the vaccine, like fever or chills, or worries about unknown long-term side effects. I was prepared that she might say that the vaccine could change her DNA, her genetic makeup. I was surprised by her response. My friend said that the vaccine was a political football. She said, half of my friends tell me I need to get the vaccine to protect my community, while the other half of my friends say that natural immunity from COVID is far more protective and much less risky than getting vaccinated, and that vaccination is an infringement on my liberty. She went on to say, I'm an independent politically, but I am so jarred by the crossfire between my friends that I've avoided getting vaccinated. Which responses went through my head? 1, I need to tell her she is crazy not to take the shot. Millions of people have gotten vaccinated, and research has proven that the vaccine is safe and effective. 2, I need to tell her to do her part and get the vaccine for the greater good. 3, ooh, I'm keeping my mouth shut on this one. It's way too political for me to get involved in. I will probably ruin our friendship for life if I say something. Now, these days, it may not surprise you that most Americans would pick response number 3. Keep your mouth shut. Which way did I go? Well, because one of my eclectic hobbies is to seek out challenging conversations, I didn't pick any of these responses. I went in a completely different way. But before I tell you how I responded to my friend, I'd like to share another story about a different vaccine. Back in 2014, public health researchers were trying to get parents to vaccinate their kids against the measles. And they put together a series of images and messages, including sick kids who had measles and even a dramatic narrative of an infant who almost died of measles, to show parents what could happen if their kids did not get vaccinated and actually got measles. Which of these images or messages do you think increased parents' desire to vaccinate their kids? None of them. They had messages as well refuting the false claim that vaccines caused autism. And what was fascinating is that not only did parents feel less confident about vaccinating their kids after seeing these images, some parents even felt that vaccines caused autism. That belief was strengthened. This story talks about how, when communicating science, facts are not enough. There's an art to science communication. Back to my friend. After hearing about her being in the political crossfire, I asked her a question. You're an independent, right? Does that mean you're an independent thinker? She nodded. She told me how important it was for her to make up her own mind, to weigh the pros and the cons of getting vaccinated. And I suggested that she do some research and think really carefully about whether she wanted to get vaccinated or not. I asked if I could send her some articles to get her started. She nodded again. Several weeks later, I was elated when my friend texted me to say she'd taken the vaccine and was recommending it to others. But I was particularly heartened that I could turn off those voices in my head telling me to focus only on the facts and instead have a genuine conversation with my friend in which I listened deeply and really tried to hear where she was coming from. This approach, this relational style to science communication, the art of communicating science, is listening to somebody with empathy and curiosity rather than pouncing on them with the latest facts and statistics. It's as important as the facts. Walt Whitman once wrote, "Be curious, not judgmental." I would paraphrase Whitman to say, "Get curious, not furious." This is not a new idea. The Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote about logos, ethos, and pathos. Logos are your facts. But if you focus only on the facts, you can end up with the boomerang effect, where your facts have the opposite effect of what you intended. Similar to that vaccines and measles study I told you about. Ethos is your credibility as a speaker, not just your credentials, but how trustworthy you appear. And pathos, that's your emotional connection to your audience through listening deeply, through being curious, through allowing your audience to be heard. 2,500 years after Aristotle, we're recognizing the importance of combining ethos and pathos with logos. And I would add a fourth element, that of affirming your audience as independent thinkers and respecting their autonomy. Whether you're talking about COVID or climate change or any other contentious issue facing our world, think about how you can bring your audience into the conversation. In summary, wherever you are and whatever role you play in your community, whether you're talking to your Aunt Susan or your Uncle Steve. How can we all get better at communicating science to the public? Well, rather than telling people what they should do, what we think is best for them, and figuring out the best messaging, instead, draw them into the dialogue. Connect with them emotionally. Respect their autonomy. Get curious, not furious. This approach may also be a way forward toward healing our deep divisions as Americans by inviting us to find common ground as we tackle our nation's challenges together. An emphasis on public engagement lies at the heart and the art of communicating science. Thank you.
We got to hear it for Dr. Beth Mallow. Come on. One of the beautiful things about working with this program is that we get to meet all of the just gifted humans who work on this campus. And Dr. Mallow is such a gift, not just to Vanderbilt, but to the world with all that she offers to us. And so I'm so happy that we know her now. And she's also so kind, which is so great, right? Just kind people. All right, we are ready for our next talk. Our fourth idea worth spreading is brought to the red circle by Danny Nguyen. Danny is a senior studying molecular and cellular biology in medicine, health, and society. He was born and raised in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, its poorest and most dangerous neighborhood. In his free time, he writes op-eds on prostitution, education, and housing rights, which have been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Tennessean, and the Frisk, among others. After graduation, he aimed to pursue journalism, covering human rights and biology. His goal with journalism is simple. He hopes to use his unconventional background as a sex worker to tell other unheard stories and to spark change. He is excited to tell his firsthand experience with prostitution prior to attending Vanderbilt with his talk, How a Prostitute Infiltrated America's Elite Colleges. Please welcome Danny to the stage.
It embodies the American dream, which is to make something out of nothing. So it's not surprising that people like Cardi B have been able to capture the attention of millions of fans as she tells her story of her meteoric rise from being a stripper and gang member in the Bronx to becoming a top-selling, Grammy Award-winning female rapper. But stories like hers are rare. According to a report by The Guardian, only about 8% of US children from the bottom 20% of the economic ladder actually make it to the top 20% as adults. So, teachers told me to stay in school. It maximized my chances of being part of that lucky 8% that would make it out of San Francisco's Tenderloin district. But the Tenderloin district was no ordinary neighborhood. The city had neglected it for decades, and now it was filled with poverty, crime, drug use, homelessness, homeless tents, human feces, and urine all over the streets. This was a biohazard that wasn't safe for anybody to live in. But my family's one-bedroom apartment wasn't much better. It was filled with mice, mold, and the notorious San Francisco chilly air that the poor insulation let in. And with homophobic parents threatening to kick me out, I needed to find a safety net fast. So I looked at what other college students in San Francisco were doing to survive. Now, most of them picked up a full-time minimum wage job. This was what was most accessible to them as high school seniors or high school graduates. Maybe this could have been a good way out. Well, upon further inspection, I saw that it was these same people that stood outside food banks because they couldn't afford their next meal. They also had trouble paying rent sometimes. $15 an hour, or $2,400 a month, just wasn't enough to survive in a city where the average one-bedroom apartment costs $2,800. So with some research, I reasoned that prostitution was my best option. In just a couple hours of work every week, I could make more than enough money to save up about a year's worth of living expenses just in case my parents kicked me out. But I wasn't naive to the dangers of prostitution. I knew that prostitutes were far more likely to be victims of serial killers than the average US citizen. I also knew that the police didn't really care about our deaths. Why would they waste time and money investigating the murder of someone who likely wouldn't be missed when they were gone? Prostitutes were rarely reported missing in the first place. So to the police, prostitutes were just objects for a rape, sex extortion, and incarceration during sting operations. But the opportunity was too good to pass up. So I put my first ad up on a prostitution board, and in less than a day, I had my first client. Now, after exchanging a couple text messages, I knew his age, location, and appearance. I also knew what he wanted: a 30-minute blowjob for $300. But this outcall was just further from the city than I liked. He offered to drive me to his place, though, so on the day we were supposed to meet, I waited for him by a deserted subway station. Eventually, a gray sedan pulled up, and I got in. As soon as we drove off, he told me to turn off my phone. In any horror movie, I would end up dead. I was ready to jump out of that car if I had to, even though we were speeding onto a highway at 50 miles an hour. But after a couple minutes of small talk, I learned that he didn't mean any harm. You see, because I was new to prostitution, I wasn't used to the coded language that many prostitutes and clients used to allude to transactional sex. So, because I was so blunt with my conversations about sex, he thought that I could have been part of some police sting operation and was ready to entrap him in a compromising situation. Obviously, this wasn't the case, but this wasn't an irrational thought. Police sting operations targeting both the prostitute and the client were very common at the time and even today. So if caught, we would be fined, jailed, and charged with a misdemeanor, and his career as a researcher and professor at a top university would be over. So the man I thought would murder me actually feared me. Now, I also had a lot to lose if I was caught. You see, I risked my life and my professional career every time I saw a new client. The more I engaged in prostitution, the more likely I was to just encounter that wrong person, and most of the time, that would be a cop or a murderer. I would have rather met a murderer any day. It sounds strange, because a misdemeanor can be expunged after a while, but successive charges were inevitable with survival sex, and if I was caught again, my misdemeanor could be promoted to a felony. Employment opportunities would be incredibly scarce with a felony if they weren't already with a misdemeanor, and even my college financial aid package could be jeopardized with a felony charge for a sex crime. And I was unwilling to give up my education. It was my best way out of the Tenderloin. So at that time, I also looked at applying to transfer from my college in San Francisco to an elite university. Elite universities had always marketed themselves as gatekeepers to near guaranteed social mobility for low-income students. But there was no roadmap for leaving prostitution and entering elite higher education. But I knew I needed to secure a position at an elite university somehow. All I could really do was apply. But when I did, I saw that many of these universities asked for my criminal history. This made me nervous. If my next client was a cop waiting to arrest me, I would likely be automatically rejected from many of these universities. My best ticket out of the Tenderloin district would have been ripped away from me by the police. I would have rather been dead. Still, I'll admit that it wasn't all bad. I had plenty of opportunities to just have fun and explore my sexuality with my clients. It wasn't unusual for them to make fetish or BDSM requests, which I very much indulged in and entertained. And it also wasn't unusual for them to build very close relationships with me. For instance, a former client of mine that learned of my living situation in the Tenderloin even housed me temporarily while I was back in San Francisco for summer and winter break, which I'm very grateful for. But after 2 years in the sex industry, I was burnt out. Transactional sex wasn't fun for me anymore, so I had to find something else. Coincidentally, I was accepted by a couple elite universities at this time and chose Vanderbilt, which was my most affordable option. Now, this could have been a good time to leave prostitution, considering I was moving to a new state and had a full ride to Vanderbilt. But I wasn't convinced just yet. You see, during last Thanksgiving break, prior obligations, mainly health appointments and important face-to-face meetings, forced me to go back to San Francisco. But I couldn't stay at my former client's place this time, and I was very much unwilling to stay at my parents' place. So I could either live on the streets or a homeless shelter, both of which were equally bad options, or I could find the money to afford a week's stay in a hotel in one of the most expensive cities in the world during the holiday season. Now, I chose that latter option because it was my safest bet, but I had to come up with this money somehow. The most accessible way for a college student to come up with that money was likely just getting a campus job. But campus jobs only paid $10 an hour. This was nothing in San Francisco, where people were struggling on $15 an hour. So if I were to make enough money through a campus job, I would have to sacrifice time spent pursuing extracurricular activities like scientific lab research and freelance writing, both of which were important for the long-term goal: education, or employment after education. And I couldn't forget about that. That was the reason why I came to an elite university in the first place. So once again, prostitution was my best option. But as a first semester senior at the time, I was very hesitant to re-enter the field. I was so close to being part of that lucky 8% that would make it out of the Tenderloin district. I couldn't be caught by the police now of all times. But the opportunity was just too good to pass up, so I took it. Now, stories like mine are not unheard of in higher education. According to the Harvard Public Health Review, about 5% of US college students have joined the sex industry to pay for college, and these students do it all, from legal stripping, porn, and webcamming, to illegal prostitution. And colleges have a duty to care for all of their students, including this subset. But colleges don't really do that. You know, most of them try to in some way. For instance, many colleges send representatives, both student and administrative, to places like Capitol Hill. And there, they tell stories of, say, low-income students. And in doing so, they aim to set the stage for improvements in federal financial aid policies. But stories of student sex workers, especially student prostitutes, are often unheard of or forgotten about in these spaces. And this isn't really surprising. Directly advocating for safer, perhaps even decriminalized prostitution is far too taboo. It would garner mixed reviews from legislators and the general public who are still debating the morality of prostitution. However, advocating for increased educational access for lower income students is far more fashionable and generally uncontested in higher education. But what good does an increase in federal financial aid do for a student prostitute whose education is so easily derailed by a single misdemeanor or felony? Then, decriminalizing prostitution becomes an educational issue that is just as worthy of a council on Capitol Hill. Now today, I hope that I've changed your idea of who a prostitute is. You may not have thought that a prostitute could make it to an elite university and study molecular and cellular biology. I sure didn't when I first applied. We're plenty smart, but even if we aren't, we're still worthy of human decency. But to the legal and educational system, people like me are just criminals who are not worthy of any legally legitimate form of social mobility, including higher education. But what if we want to leave prostitution? When will our stories finally be heard? Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Let's hear it for Danny one more time. So happy, Danny, you were able to bring your story to our stage. Now, we are 4 talks into this fantastic event. How are you all doing? Fantastic. We're going to have a 15-minute break during which we invite you to mingle in the lobby, visit the vending machine, take care of personal matters. We have one question we want you to think about during the intermission, and also we hope that you engage with your fellow TEDxVandy goers. That's why we gave you name tags. Connect with each other. Make a new friend. Don't be afraid of strangers. Now, you all enjoy your break, but here's the question we want you to ponder during the time that you have out of your seats. What's something new that you have learned during our first 4 TEDxVandy talks? What's something that you are definitely going to keep pondering as you leave this building today? Go ahead and tweet it at TEDxVandy, #TEDxVandy, and we'll come back to this space in 15 minutes, which I have no idea what time that is, but we'll see you in 15 minutes. We'll call you back in when we're ready for the show to start. So thank you all so much. Enjoy your intermission. Did you have a good break? Yeah, absolutely. Well, while you all were on break, we were on Twitter. That's how we spend our free time here. And we have another prize winner. Are you excited to know who it is? This person's name is Abatista Jess. Come on up. Give our winner a round of applause. We have a giveaway for you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the social media. Appreciate it. I hope you enjoy. Yeah. All right, so we are about to launch into the second half of our show. Are you excited? The first half was so great. Oh my gosh, weren't they wonderful? Just stars and sunshine. We have even more fire for you. How crazy is that, right? So get excited, because now we're going to hear from Erin Halfkinshiel. All right. Erin is the president of Think Tennessee, where she leads a powerhouse team working to build a state where all Tennesseans are civically engaged and economically secure. Erin has spent her career in public policy, including roles in higher education, municipal government, and philanthropy. And most recently, she was the executive director for mobility and transportation at Vanderbilt University. We're sad that she's gone. But prior to that, she served as the director of the Mayor's Office of Transportation and Sustainability for Nashville Mayors David Briley and Megan Barry. She is currently pursuing a PhD in civil infrastructure systems at Vanderbilt University. For her idea, Erin explores past infrastructure decisions and how they have impacted our lack of transportation choices today. So let's welcome to the stage, Erin.
Good afternoon. Today, I want to talk to you about transportation choices. But first, I want to ask you a question. How many of you drove here today? How many of you walked, biked, or took transit? I see a few. Chances are you drove. 75% of Americans drive alone to work every day. What's interesting to me is that when I ask people this question, they often say that they choose to drive. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's not actually a choice, it's by design. Decades of building infrastructure only for cars has left us with cities where we have to drive everywhere, even to the grocery store across the street. I believe creating more sustainable, more equitable, more walkable cities is key to our future, and that change starts with our streets. I've spent my career working in transportation planning, but I want to tell you about the ones nearest and dearest to me and how the way we design our cities impacts them. My family goes for bike rides every weekend. We are lucky to live in a neighborhood with sidewalks. My middle daughter is a total ripper on her balance bike, much to the chagrin of her very competitive older sister. A few weeks ago, on our walk, my oldest daughter raced ahead of us. As she was approaching the intersection at full speed, my heart started racing and I jogged after her. Just before I yelled, "Stop!" she came to a screeching halt, putting her arm out to slow down her younger sister, who had definitely raced after her. They waited patiently for me to catch up, and when I reached them, my oldest said, "Mom, we checked for cars and there aren't any coming." I sighed with relief. My warnings had sunk in, because I know that the most dangerous thing we do every day is use our public streets. Motor vehicle crashes are a top 10 leading cause of death for all ages 1 to 54, but the stats are particularly heartbreaking for young kids. Car accidents are the number 2 leading cause of death for children ages 5 to 9. It is the leading cause for youth 15 to 24. I want safer streets for my kids today. I want better cities for their future. In most cities, streets are our largest public space. They are one of our most important public assets. And in America, we believe we have the freedom to choose whatever we want, especially how we get around. But does this look like a space where our freedom is being maximized, our city's assets being cared for, a place we'd want our kids to play? It definitely doesn't to me. My story today is about Nashville, but it could be about nearly any American city. I want to start by comparing transportation choices between Nashville and New York. Now I know Nashville and New York are 2 very different cities, but Google Maps can help show us how different our transportation options can be. I picked 2 trips close to 2.5 miles, both on a workday morning. In Nashville, driving would take about 9 to 16 minutes with ample free parking. In New York, driving might take 10 minutes, but more likely over 30 with lots of extra time and money for parking. In Nashville, riding the bus, if it came on time, would take about 30 minutes and require 17 minutes of walking. While in New York, taking the subway would reliably take only about 15 minutes. In Nashville, walking would take about 40 minutes, but requires walking past a large car dealership, over the interstate, and across the railroad tracks. While those same 40 minutes in New York take you by the Flatiron Building, through Union Square Park, and along iconic Fifth Avenue. So which mode would you choose? In Nashville, I would drive. In New York, I would take the subway. In Nashville, even though we know choosing an option other than driving is better for our health and better for our city, we still drive. Because choosing other options are inconvenient and often unsafe. The truth is, the choice to drive was made for us by others decades ago. We have been told a story that cars equal freedom, and that suburbia is the natural evolution of the American dream. But that's not entirely true. I'm going to share 4 examples of how our transportation choices were taken away from us. The first example is control over our streets. These are photos of downtown Nashville around 1920. You probably noticed that the cars are sharing the street, with streetcars, with pedestrians, even an American flag. A few years after these photos were taken, car companies invented the term jaywalking, crossing the street unlawfully or without regard for approaching traffic, and helped pass legislation across the country to make jaywalking a crime. And then, just to make sure there wasn't anyone in their way, they launched a propaganda campaign to shame pedestrians into complying with these new laws. They quite literally cleared the way for cars to take over our streets. The second example is the disappearance of streetcars. Nashville was actually planned around transit. There were streetcars on nearly all of today's major corridors. In fact, there were 17,000 miles of streetcar tracks nationwide. Streetcars operated in Nashville for over 50 years as private companies, but as cars started to become more prevalent, they were struggling to stay competitive. Then, in the 40s and 50s, a group of automakers stepped in and started buying bankrupt streetcar systems, eventually purchasing 46 transit networks. Today, less than 170 miles remain of the original 17,000. As tracks were ripped up, it helped create the legacy that public transit doesn't deserve public funding or space on our streets. The third example is missing sidewalks. For nearly 100 years, Nashville built neighborhoods without sidewalks. Before World War II, sidewalk construction was the responsibility of the homeowner, not the city. After the war, sidewalks in residential neighborhoods weren't required until 1991. But by then, the damage had been done. Nashville has a fraction of the sidewalks that it needs, a deficit that would cost the city over $10 billion. The fourth example is street design guidelines. Even today, our National Street Design Manual prioritizes vehicles over other modes. While safety is a stated priority, our most vulnerable road users are not being protected. This is an intersection near Vanderbilt, a K-12 school, and 2 childcare centers. In September 2021, a kindergarten teacher and student were crossing in the crosswalk when they were hit by a car. The teacher heroically pushed the child out of harm's way and took the brunt of the crash herself. Fortunately, they are both doing okay. But when we advocated for change, there was concern about vehicle delay, even after an accident. We pushed to install a camera to manually count pedestrians, and while some were expecting a few hundred pedestrians, we counted over 3,200 using this intersection in 24 hours. Immediately, a 4-way stop sign was installed, a much safer intersection design. As pedestrians were relegated to crosswalks, streetcars disappeared, sidewalks never built, and streets engineered to maximize speed over safety, our streets became very unfriendly places for people not in a car. Would you let your child bike in this bike lane? I know I wouldn't. Choosing sustainable transportation options is not just about our choices today. It's about the decisions that were made in the past. Okay, now if you're anything like me, you might be feeling a little upset right about now. But this is actually good news, because if these decisions were made in the past for us, we can start making different decisions going forward. Decisions that give us real transportation independence. Take a moment to think about a city where you love to walk. What do their streets have that ours don't? Wide sidewalks, street trees, more seating, more transportation options, interesting buildings, and slower speeds. This isn't rocket science. We too can have streets where we feel comfortable letting our children walk on their own. Imagine that. To do this, we must reclaim our streets. Streets designed only for cars are dangerous streets. We need streets for all road users. Small changes make a big difference. Every new crosswalk and stop sign matters, just like every blocked sidewalk tells a pedestrian that they aren't important. Second, we must invest in more transportation options, especially public transit. The legacy of the past is that 80% of federal funding goes towards roads and highways, leaving pennies for everything else. Low levels of funding means low levels of service. High-quality transit attracts riders, but not enough people are riding transit today because we fund it to be a last choice option. Good transit lifts people up. Bad transit keeps them down. And finally, we must reject a two-tiered transportation system designed only for those with cars. 30% of Americans can't or don't drive, leaving them with no options for getting around. This is the opposite of freedom. Many of our bus stops don't have sidewalks. Riders must wait in storm ditches. Quite simply, our transportation system keeps people from accessing jobs and schools. In the land of opportunity, we can't accept a second-class transportation system. When we change our streets, we transform our cities into more sustainable, livable, and equitable places. Places our children can grow and thrive. I know that's what I want for my daughters. So I urge you to get engaged. Call your local elected officials and tell them it's unacceptable to wait a generation for sidewalks on your street. Ask them for lower speed limits and safer intersections. Because when we prioritize pedestrians, cyclists, and transit when designing our streets, we level the playing field and make those real options we can choose to get around. Together, we can take back our cities, one street at a time. Thank you.
Let's give it up again for Erin. I know I look forward to the days where I can use my car less, maybe spend that gas money on something else. So thank you, Erin, for your work. Our penultimate speaker of the day is Clifford B. Anderson. Cliff is Associate University Librarian for Research and Digital Strategy at the Vanderbilt University Library. He has a secondary appointment as Professor of Religious Studies in the College of Arts and Science and is affiliated faculty in the Comparative Media Analysis and Practice Joint PhD program. Among other publications, he is the author of 2 recent articles on deepfakes, A New Hermeneutics of Suspicion, The Challenge of Deepfakes to Theological Epistemology. Clifford's words challenge me. And Empathy in an Age of Deepfakes. Cliff is here today to help us learn how we establish the truth when the images and videos around us may be lying. Let's welcome Clifford B. Anderson to the stage.
In the 1960s, a Nashville insurance executive named Paul Simpson sat down to watch the evening news. Among the stories he viewed that night was an interview with Timothy Leary, the ex-Harvard psychology professor, famous for calling on young people to tune on, turn on, and drop out. Simpson couldn't believe what he had heard that night. Had someone on national television just called on the youth of America to take drugs and drop out of school? Later, Simpson paid a visit to the network headquarters to see if he could get a copy of the tape, but no recording was available to be found. At that time, networks routinely recycled their copies to save on costs. There was no way for Simpson to verify what he had heard. Simpson's frustrating experience forms the origin story of the Vanderbilt Television News Archive. The Vanderbilt Television News Archive was started by Paul Simpson and Frank Grisham, director of the libraries, in August 1968 to record television news and to make it accessible to researchers, historians, and the public at large. My colleagues and I continue that mission today, recording the television news every evening and preserving it for posterity. But there are new threats to the integrity of media on the horizon that go far beyond anything our founders could have imagined. Fast forward in time. You're fleeing an enemy force invading your homeland. An artillery shell has struck the transmission tower in your neighborhood, so you can't get updates from the radio or television. A fellow refugee tells you that the president has just put out a video calling on the army to lay down its weapons and for you to return to your home. Shocked, you pull out your cell phone to search the internet, and you find a video saying just that. At least it looks like the president, and it sounds like the president, but you're just not sure. What should you do? Should you press forward or turn back? What our unfortunate citizen has just seen is a deep fake. What is a deep fake? Well, deep fake combines two terms, deep learning, which is a type of machine learning or artificial intelligence, with the adjective fake. As the name implies, deep fakes transpose the visage and voices of people into artificial settings, making them say and do things they never actually did. More broadly, deepfakes belong to the category of synthetic media. Synthetic media portrays people in situations that never actually happened. Now, synthetic media has actually been around for a long time. Digital media artists have created fantastic sequences that have thrilled moviegoers, produced by filming actors against green screens and then painstakingly editing that footage in post-production. The thing is, it used to take time and a lot of effort and a high level of expertise to produce this kind of synthetic media. In 2014, then doctoral student Ian Goodfellow invented a new technique called a Generative Adversarial Network, or GAN. Goodfellow's discovery of GANs sped up the creation of realistic synthetic media. And researchers around the world have been adapting and refining his techniques, sharing their models publicly on coding sites like GitHub. The term deepfake first appeared in 2017 when a user named Deepfake created an eponymous community on the social networking site Reddit. That community attracted people interested in the basics of synthetic media and liking to share their products with others. When the journalist Samantha Cole caught wind of this community and wrote about it for the online news network Vice in the same year, the term deepfake exploded into popular consciousness. So what motivates someone to create a deepfake? Well, some people just enjoy the sheer thrill of bending reality a little, swapping Nicolas Cage into movies that he never starred in, or imagining what Nixon might have said if the lunar lander had crashed on impact. Concupiscence compels others. A recent survey shows that the most common reason for making deepfakes is to take celebrities' likenesses and put them into sexually explicit media. In fact, in 2018, Reddit banned the community r/deepfakes because of its policy against what it terms involuntary pornography. But deepfakes have continued to proliferate nevertheless. In fact, in March 2022, the worry that experts have long had came to pass as deepfakes now take the form of synthetic propaganda. A deepfake of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky appeared on social networking channels, calling on his forces to surrender to the Russians. Now, that deepfake was poorly made and quickly detected, but it serves as a harbinger of things to come. What happens when seeing is no longer believing? How do we establish the truth when the images and videos around us may be lying? Now let's pause to talk about some of the good things that are coming out of these revolutions in the production of synthetic media. After all, synthetic media has transported us to distant galaxies and taken us into alternative dimensions. Now that those tools are becoming available to the average person, what good purposes can we put them toward? Software companies right now are building the underlying machine learning techniques into their products, and they are allowing us to do amazing things. For example, you can clone your own voice to make a synthetic podcast, or you can rotoscope objects automatically out of your videos if you don't like what's in the background, or you can dub yourself speaking a language that you don't even know. Synthetic media promises to open up new vistas of creativity for us as individuals. And as a society, we've gotten used to edited video feeds in a way that would have proved surprising to us just a few years ago. No, your colleague isn't calling into work from Tahiti, even though the video in her background shows waves rolling over a sandy beach. I'm here live. I'm not a cat, says the mortified attorney. I can see that, says the mollifying judge. Can we learn to coexist with deepfakes in analogous ways, accepting that appearance in media is never really what it seems? A problem with taking a laissez-faire approach to deepfakes is the instinctive credence we lend to the testimony of our senses. We are psychologically hardwired to believe the evidence of our eyes and ears. Now, we can learn to judge appearance more critically. Philosophers from Plato to the pragmatists have taught strategies for weighing the evidentiary value of sensory perception. And those strategies, though, are hard to learn. And despite the best efforts of librarians to teach them, few of us have mastered the requisite critical media literacy. So what can we do to protect ourselves from the threat of deepfakes? Well, firms are working on toolkits for detecting synthetic media, but that's easier said than done. In the early days of deepfakes, it used to be that they were glitchy, and you could see that qualities hadn't transferred properly from the source video to the target video. You could look for subtle tells like fixed unblinking eyes or maybe misshapen ears. But as progress continues in machine learning, those tells are becoming fewer and farther between, and in fact will soon disappear altogether. Companies like Sensity.ai and Deepware are making media forensic toolkits that use algorithms to detect deepfakes. When they encounter a synthetic video online, they'll label it as such. But even the most optimistic technologist doesn't think that technology alone will rescue us from the peril of deepfakes. So what else can we do? What other measures do we have to defend ourselves against the threat of deepfakes? Well, there are legal remedies, but they have their limitations. Any outright ban of deepfakes would run up against our freedom of expression. We could limit our attack surface, so to speak, by reducing the amount of media that we consume. We could switch off our televisions, delete our social media accounts, and stop doom scrolling from crisis to crisis. That's good advice, especially if you have the fortitude to turn off, tune out, and move on. As individuals, we should be increasing our digital media literacy, and we should take caution about the velocity at which we consume media. Just by listening to this talk, you'll become more critical about what you hear and see online. But as a society, we need to do more to protect ourselves. The solution may come back to trusted authorities. The philosopher David Chalmers writes in his recent book, Reality Plus, that in the long run, the only way to know for sure whether an image is real or fake may be authentication by a reliable source. The Vanderbilt Television News Archive has served as a trusted repository of the television news for more than 50 years. As my colleagues and I contemplate our next 50 years, our mission of safeguarding the news as broadcast, streamed, or otherwise transmitted remains compelling and vital. We don't have all the answers about how to counteract the threat of deepfakes, but we are ready to rise to the challenge. In a dawning age of deepfakes, trusted media repositories like the Vanderbilt Television News Archive may form our last line of defense against the unchecked spread of synthetic propaganda. Thank you.
We've been concocting a future for him in podcasting where he tells us all the secrets of the earth. So we hope he takes us up on that. We have some stage management going on. Act like you don't see it. We also have our final giveaway that is going to happen right now before we bring on our final speaker. So our next winner this evening is Isabella Maddie. Oh, she's excited. Let's give it up for Isabella Maddie. Oh, there it is, right there. Gosh, I need a nap. Isabella, here you are. Thank you for being our final winner this evening. I hope you enjoy your gift. There you go. Oh my gosh, remember to tweet about it. There's no more gifts, but keep tweeting, okay? All right, I'm gonna let Chance finish up here. We're good. All right, friends. Our final speaker is Taylor Rasmussen. Taylor is a first-year MBA candidate at the Owen Graduate School of Management, concentrating in human and organizational performance and strategy. We have some Owen fans in the building, I can sense, absolutely. Taylor serves as co-vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the Owen Student Graduate Association, treasurer of Owen Out and Allied, and this is my favorite, vice president of beer for the Owen Cork and Barrel Association. Prior to pursuing their MBA, Taylor worked as a professional actor and theater maker in New York City. Thanks to her breadth of personal and professional experiences with storytelling, Taylor has become an advocate for using imagination as a catalyst for creativity, growth, and development, as well as rest and restoration. So please welcome our final speaker to the stage, Taylor.
You and your party, your companions, have spent a long, hard day on the road from Geldeneth. The weather is clear for now, but dark clouds on the horizon herald an inevitable storm. Your party's druid, naturally in tune with the ebb and flow of the magics of the natural world, tells your party that the storm will break within the hour. You need to find shelter. It doesn't take long before all of you come upon a cheery little roadside tavern, built of hardwood planks and with stone pillars on either side of the door. The windows are made of colorful stained glass, so it's difficult to see inside, but you can all hear the sounds of joyful music and full-bellied laughter. Your fighter, always itching for a good meal, strides boldly forward, but your rogue, a distrustful individual who has been burned by the affect of good cheer one too many times, darts ahead, insisting upon checking the tavern door for traps. Their nimble fingers make light investigative work of the structure, when abruptly they freeze. The tavern door is trapped. Your wizard waves an inquisitive hand and, with wide eyes, reveals to the party that the air is thick with enchantment magic. What do you do? I find that open-ended questions like that can really throw people for a loop sometimes. What do you do? It's almost a harder question when the options seem limitless. How do you reach a conclusion that feels both satisfying and safe? And, adding another layer of complication to the mix is the fact that this is a group decision. Your druid and your fighter and your rogue and your wizard all kind of have to be on the same page. And, so do you, by the way, who are you? I mean, personal preference, I would say either artificer or sorcerer, but you already have an intelligence caster in the party, and at the moment, your druid is probably the only healer, so I'm feeling pretty inclined to chuck a cleric into the mix, even if you wanted to multi-class. Oh my gosh, sorcerer, cleric, multi-class, oh, so much fun and awesome for character development. Not great if you're trying to min-max, though, so all things considered, I think we should call you a celestial warlock. Yes, okay, you are a celestial warlock. Are we all on the same page? Okay, that's more folks than I thought, but for those of you who are still looking at me a little blankly, I kind of didn't think so. Thing is, I love Dungeons and Dragons, and a lot of other people love Dungeons and Dragons too. Wizards of the Coast, which is the company that makes and distributes D&D content, estimates that 50 million people worldwide play D&D. Sales of D&D materials, like how-to books and official subscriptions to online content, increased by 33% in 2020, following a 6-year consecutive growth streak. And the prevalence of streamed D&D games like Critical Role, Dimension 20, and High Rollers have helped to inject elements of this iconic role-playing game, or RPG, into the popular vernacular, the pop culture vernacular, rather. So, this game is popular and increasingly so. My question then is this. Why was I met with a few blank stares, as well as a few generous chuckles, when I spoke with some degree of specificity about sorcerers and warlocks and clerics? Let me ask another question. How many folks in this room self-identify as adults? Yeah, you know, you can vote, you pay taxes, your driver's license might be horizontal instead of vertical at this point. I don't want to pay taxes. Might be. Your decisions have consequences attached to them, you know. Adults. Yeah, okay, me too. I self-identify as an adult at this point in my life. There's a thing that happens as we grow up, and it's called the explore-exploit trade-off. The concept is pretty intuitive. Basically, it's that we, as thinking, rational, autonomous agents, learn as we go. And the more we learn about our environments, the more we put what we learn to use. So, for example, you can't know how much you hate black licorice, which literally at me, I think it is absolutely gross. You can't know that until you've explored, until you've tasted black licorice. And then once you've explored, once you have access to that information, I hate black licorice, you can exploit it. You can put it to use and avoid black licorice in the future, say. But the thing that happens as we become adults is that we tend to lean pretty hard on the exploit half of that equation. Once we've made that initial exploration, we don't like to explore much further, not usually. We are less inclined to try other flavors of licorice, even though they might be delicious, because staying away from all licorice seems safer. And you know, this is not by definition a bad thing. Self-preservation is something that we learn as we grow up too. I think one of the hallmarks of adulthood is the stakes attached to our decisions. You know, suppose a child tries playing soccer for the first time and they discover that they don't like it. It's not really a big deal. That child can take an art class tomorrow. If an adult starts a new career and they discover 1 month in that they are absolutely miserable, the process of changing course is far more involved. So, in other words, it makes sense that we like to stick with what we know and with what makes us feel safe. By contrast, children, who almost always know less about their environments than adults do, tend to be far more exploratory than their grown-up counterparts. A 2021 study published in the International Journal of Cognitive Science sought to test just how this explore-exploit trade-off manifests in adults and children. And it discovered that children's exploratory behavior makes them better learners than adults, especially in environments that are complex and in situations where there are costs and risks. So, what does this have to do with Dungeons and Dragons and with our perplexed party, still stuck at the trapped tavern door? Simple. Put yourself into the well-worn boots of that weary, waterlogged celestial warlock. What do you do? In this situation, you and your friends don't know much about your environment. You don't have much information that you can exploit. And so, in one way or another, you have to explore. Now, we can all acknowledge that this is a world of fantasy and make-believe, yes, but the opportunity to flex that exploration muscle, that is real. Dungeons and Dragons and other RPGs that ask players to take on the role of thinking, feeling autonomous people with wants and needs and goals and fears and motivations and desires. Games like this allow us to explore safely as adults. And by the way, we don't just have to explore our environments, we can explore ourselves too. And I think that's the crux of it for me, personally. My artificer is selfish. And through him, I have learned a lot about what I value in interpersonal relationships. My sorcerer cleric is slowly becoming a risk taker. And through him, I have become far more comfortable with ambiguity and with questions that don't have concrete answers. And it's probably worth mentioning that both of these player characters are transgender men. And in that way, my Dungeons & Dragons games were safe places for me to investigate facets of personal identity without having to risk something like a big public coming out that I wouldn't be able to take back. Consider this. How often do you exploit? And how often do you explore? Are you the kind of person that makes time for imagination and play? And if you're not, if you're not the kind of person who prioritizes play, I get it. It can be so easy to glorify the grind and to brag about how much sleep we didn't get last night and how much work we got done last week. But because of that, a lot of us are defaulting to exploitation, and we might not be making enough space for exploration, for the chance to learn and grow and know ourselves better. So I urge you, learn everything you can about the Enchanted Tavern. Discover for yourself whether you're the kind of person who beats down the door or sneaks around back to find a kitchen staff entrance or wins over the barkeep with a wink and a charming smile. I hope you have fun. I hope you make dangerous decisions. I hope you try something absolutely harebrained that you don't think will work just to see what happens. And most of all, I hope that you and your whole adventuring party return to the real world better for it. But, it's your call. What do you do? Thank you.
Part of the purpose of TEDxVandy is to open a space for critical thought and dialogue. The conversation has just begun, so don't let it end here. We wanted to open your mind to the diversity of experiences and perspectives that exist as a part of our campus community. We would like to thank the TEDxVanderbiltUniversity planning team for all of their work in pulling this together. Let's go ahead and give those folks a hand. Could all of my speakers on the stage, from backstage in front of the house, could you all make your way up here? Let's give them a big old round of applause, a few woo-hoos. I know that I can speak for everyone in this audience when I say a big thank you to all of you. You have certainly filled our stage with ideas worth sharing, and I can't wait to see what happens as you continue to share your message. So thank you all so much. I know that this is work. I hope you found it as worthwhile work. All right, thank you all so much. Now, before you all depart, please be on the lookout for an evaluation of TEDxVandy in your inbox. And if and when we receive the license to host this event next year, we'd love to have your feedback in order to make sure that we can make positive change to the experience. Keep posting your thoughts on social media, and remember that our speakers will be around if you're looking to chat with them. And also, let's make sure to clean up around ourselves before we depart. So thank you again for being a great audience. And perhaps we'll see you on stage in this red circle next year. What will be your idea worth spreading? Thank you.